Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, especially after a long holiday break. I know it's sometimes difficult to get back into the swing of things, so really appreciate you being here. So today, as Stephanie said, we're going to talk about navigating uncertainty. And the reason why is probably pretty clear. It's a very timely discussion to have at a time like this with so much uncertainty in the world and so much uncertainty in our personal lives. So we're going to break down uncertainty first by defining it, getting into the psychology of it, some common responses to navigating uncertainty, the upside of uncertainty we're going to speak about briefly, and shockingly, yes, there is an upside to it, which we'll talk about. And then we're going to spend some time talking about coping with uncertainty, which I think is a really important piece to today's discussion, often overlooked. So what is uncertainty? Really, it's limited knowledge about an occurrence, making it difficult to control, plan, or predict a future outcome, right? But it's also the inability to predict our behavior, the behavior of others, and the world around us. We also know that it brings about typically an aversive feeling that is experienced when we're uncertain about ourselves or someone else. So there's an internal piece to it as well, of course. We can be uncertain about our identity, who we are, as well as the world. So if I'm thinking about, what uncertainty really is given all of these definitions, we can think about unpredictable events, ambiguous circumstances that are out of our control, difficult to plan, predict. And of course, if you're thinking about anything related to the future, well, the future is clearly uncertain. So this brings about a lot of distress, and we're going to talk about why. Before we get to that, though, I want to start thinking about where uncertainty is in our lives and in the world. Short answer is, well, everywhere, right? But the first part of kind of unpacking uncertainty is bringing some awareness to it, thinking about where the uncertainty lies in the world and within our lives is a really helpful first step. So if we just think about what's going on in the world right now, God, we can think about lots of uncertainty based on world events. The pandemic, well, that was an extremely uncertain event, an ambiguous event, an event that was difficult to control. We had no understanding of what was going on, how to deal with it. So it's really understandable why that was so anxiety-inducing for all of us, and in such a unique way. Our health, we're now looking kind of internally, our identity, our finances, the environment. Many of us may be new to the area. Maybe you were never in New York prior to starting your career at Columbia. So the environment, in and of itself, there's a lot of uncertainty there. Even just thinking about getting to and from work and school each day, a lot of uncertainty in getting here, right? That can bring about a lot of anxiety and distress as well. Our finances, all of these things I'm sure are resonating with you. But I want to take a minute and check in to see in what ways uncertainty is experienced in your life. So you'll see a QR code right here, and I see you taking out your phones already, which is awesome. This is going to bring you to a PDF. You're welcome to use the PDF, or you can ignore it if it's difficult to navigate on your phone. But we wanted to leave you with something to bring home today. So at the very least, even if you don't use it today during our discussion, it will give you at least the start of a little toolkit that you can use later on when you're navigating uncertainty in your life. I wanted you to think, though, just for a minute about my prior slide, uncertainty in our lives, and just think about what resonates with you in particular and why, right? Maybe all of these things do in a certain way, or maybe something that's not on here. Maybe you're thinking about specifics of one certain area that I touched on. Just curious, does anyone want to share out any initial thoughts about what on here resonates with you, or maybe something else entirely that we didn't touch on? All of them. Yes. Yeah, exactly. I'm assuming that's the case for most, if not all of you, right? I'm seeing a lot of head nods. So keep those in mind, because we're going to go back to those in a little bit. But I want to shift to kind of how we experience uncertainty, because we typically experience uncertainty in two ways. We can experience it as a challenge, and this is when we adopt promotive or approach behaviors. This is when we're really engaging with the trigger, we're engaging with the uncertainty, we're figuring out how to actively cope. And then the other main way that we engage with or experience uncertainty is as a threat. This is when we adopt protective or avoidant behaviors. Usually we try to distance ourselves from the trigger when we're experiencing uncertainty in this way, right? We distract from it, we try to avoid. We go through a lot to try to distance ourselves from the trigger, and we'll get to this a little bit more later. You may be looking at these and thinking, who the heck experiences uncertainty as like a fun challenge, right? Probably the second one's resonating more with you. This is really where our focus tends to be. When we think of uncertainty, what probably pops into your mind is stress, distress, a threat, right? Something that we want to distance ourselves from or avoid, something that causes lots of anxiety and a whole bunch of other things. But if we look at the first experiencing uncertainty as a challenge, you could probably think of a couple ways that you actually do experience uncertainty as a challenge in your life. It's just kind of hard to access, but I'll give you one. If you think about, I don't know, maybe you play on a soccer team or something like that on the weekends, you don't know what the result of the game will be, right? When you play your soccer game each week. You probably don't care that much, though. You probably think of it as a fun challenge. You're going to go back for more, maybe play soccer every weekend. You probably aren't losing sleep over the uncertainty of what the end result of the game is going to be. I imagine. I mean, maybe some people are losing sleep over it, but I would say some of you may not. You may still think of it as a fun activity to do. You may not even view yourself as having to cope with the uncertainty of that scenario, right? So these experiences are happening all of the time, but our focus tends to go on what brings us a lot of distress. And this is when we're experiencing uncertainty as a threat. So we'll dig into that a little bit more so we understand why. So our brains are constantly updating our world, making judgments about what's safe and what isn't. If our brain doesn't know what's around the corner, it can't keep us out of harm's way. So what happens is we tend to assume the worst when we don't know what's around the corner, over-personalize the threat, and jump to conclusions. You've probably seen those jump to conclusion memes that are all over social media. Well, the reason that it became a meme is because we're constantly jumping to conclusions. Everyone can resonate with that and connect with that. We're jumping to conclusions all the time. Why are we doing that? And why are we jumping to the worst possible conclusion or catastrophizing? Well, it's really to protect ourselves, right? It's adaptive. We tend to overestimate the threat and underestimate our ability to handle the threat. So just take that in for a minute, because I want this to also validate your experience with uncertainty, right? The reason that we have such a visceral reaction to uncertainty is because our brain's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Again, it's adaptive. We're doing this to protect ourselves. But I like to think of it as sometimes our alarm system needs a little bit of recalibration, right? Sometimes it's a little bit off. It's not really serving us in the way that it was intended to, right? So keep that in mind, because we're going to give you some strategies about how to recalibrate. So I want to talk a little bit about our response to uncertainty. So it's a pretty well established area of research in psychology. If you go online and you're doing some research and you look up the psychology of uncertainty, lots of studies and research will pop up. But I wanted to highlight one study in particular that I think is really interesting. And in this study, participants were told that they might receive a shock, a painful shock. They were either told that they had 0% chance of a shock, 50%, or 100% chance of a shock. And what the researchers found is that participants that were told they had a 50% chance of receiving a shock were the most stressed in the end. So not the participants that were told that there was a 100% chance they were going to get a shock. So knowing that there is a small chance of getting a painful shock can actually lead to significantly more stress than knowing you will definitely get a shock. So isn't that interesting? What happens is, once we know we're going to endure pain or distress or anxiety or some form of discomfort, our brain kind of shifts over to bracing for impact, right? We now know that we're going to need to cope with the impact of the pain, whether it's physical or emotional. And we can access the tools for that in a slightly different way. When you're told that you may or may not encounter pain, we're not sure. In fact, we just don't know what the outcome is. Our brain has to do a lot more legwork, right? We have to figure out what the heck's gonna happen, and do we need to utilize some resources? Do we need support? If so, what does that look like? Do we have access to them? It's a lot. It's a lot for us to think about, and we're not in the bracing mode. We're only in the bracing mode when we know there's going to be an impact of sorts. And I will say the bracing mode is also uncomfortable and distressing, right? But just not as in certain areas, right? So it's just something to keep in mind. It's not saying that we would rather brace for a painful experience. It's just to say that we tend to react differently when we know that pain is coming versus not knowing at all. So in another study, researchers asked participants to play a game that gave them a chance of winning money. The participants had a choice to know the result immediately instead of waiting before they found out. The catch is, the immediate knowledge came with a penalty. If they didn't win the trial, they would have less chance of winning and the prize would be smaller. So what's interesting about this, you could probably guess, is that despite it being the more rational option, only about 37% of the participants in this scenario opted to wait on every single trial. Most were willing to take a financial hit in order to avoid waiting in a state of anxiety. So we also hate the uncertainty of waiting, right? This is really difficult for us as well. And we'll really do anything to avoid the uncertainty of waiting, including taking kind of a known hit, in this case, a financial hit, right? So why? Again, kind of going back to the discussion before, the brain's trying to protect us, right? It's trying to prepare the body and mind in the most effective way possible. Can't be effective if we don't know how to protect it, right? So we tend to err on the side of caution and figure out ways to either avoid the uncertainty altogether or put the brain and body in a roused state that's ready to respond. So there's that bracing response, right? So treating unknowns as a potential threat can be adaptive. And you can think of kind of why, thinking of the evolutionary piece, why this is the way it is, but how it may not serve us in all instances anymore. So again, going back to sometimes our brain needs a little bit of recalibration. So all this is happening through an appraisal process, right? And this is that cognitive process used to determine whether a stressor is a danger or an opportunity, and to evaluate the availability of coping resources to respond to the stressor. So all day long, our brain is perceiving a situation, giving attention to it. Sorry, my screen went out. Okay, it's back. Perceiving a situation, giving attention to it, and then appraising, labeling it as a threat versus an opportunity, and then responding to it. And we could respond emotionally, physically, a combination, right? It's a little bit more of an in-depth kind of process than that, of course, and we're not going to get into all of it here, but you can see in the image on the left side of the screen, it breaks it down a little bit more for you. We have the world here, which is a series of positive, negative, and neutral events. I mean, oversimplified, but you get the hang of it, right? You get the idea. And then we're understanding, interpreting, or perceiving those series of events in different ways. Then we generate thoughts or physical responses, and a lot goes into that process, right? This is based on our experiences, our worldviews, culture, right? A lot goes into this piece here. And eventually it leads to a feeling, an emotion, and a response of some sort, right? And what causes this variability in appraisals? Well, a lot of things that I just mentioned, and in addition to that, how we view the event, right? Is it congruent with our goals? If so, we can imagine that that would make the event potentially more triggering for us, right? If it's something that we really identify with or connect with, it could amplify the response. Our coping potential, right? So we may look at something and have a sense of agency, feel like we have a sense of agency, and that's also going to change our response to the event. Do we have resources? Do we have supports that we can access in order to cope with this event or circumstance? All of these things are impacting the appraisal process, right? So if you just think of something kind of neutral, right? Maybe you have a big exam or assignment coming up, right? You probably, from time to time, notice that you may be having a different response to that big assignment or exam than maybe a friend or someone in the class. Why? Well, maybe the class is really meaningful to you, and maybe for someone else, yeah, it's meaningful, but maybe in a different way. Maybe you feel like you don't have a sense of agency over the studying process for whatever reason. Like maybe you feel like, oh, no matter how hard I study, I just can't quite get a grasp of the material. Whereas someone else in the class maybe thinks, oh, you know what, I think if I study, this will have an impact on the outcome of this assignment or test. There's lots of reasons that it can impact our appraisal process, but all to say that your experience is valid, of course, and your friend's experience is valid too. But it's just something to kind of keep in mind when you notice that you or someone you know are appraising a situation slightly differently, because we tend to feel shame or kind of question ourselves when that happens. Why am I having this reaction? And seems like they don't care, they don't mind, or they're better able to cope with this. Well, there's lots of reasons for that, and both of your experiences are valid. All right, another quick check-in. So if you are using the PDF, I don't know how accessible it is for you to use. No worries if it's not. It's just something to kind of think about. When we were looking at this list before of areas of uncertainty in our life. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah. So a few of you were saying, you know what, pretty much all of these resonate with me in some way, right? I wanted to think about the appraisal process, and if you could just take a minute to think through what you would rank on your list as number one in terms of what causes the most distress for you, right? Versus maybe something that's a number 10 on your list. It's further down the list. Yeah, it brings you some distress, but not at a super high level. Just to kind of think about that. And then again, thinking about why, right? I'll give you just a minute to think that through and reflect. And just curious if anyone wants to share out any thoughts that they have just reflecting on that list. So something that maybe is a number 1 or 2 on your list in terms of something that brings you the most stress or distress versus something that's a little bit down the line on the list, something that brings you a little bit less stress or distress. I'm curious what you think comes up the most for students. So even maybe it's not high on your list, but what do you think most students probably believe brings them a lot of stress or distress from this list? Or you can even, yeah. Yeah, relationships, huge. Thank you. It's a really big one, right? Social relationships, romantic relationships, the unknown, where do we stand in our relationship? How does the other person feel about me? Relationships with professors, with deans, right? Any other thoughts? I know also, I'll just say, world events, especially given what's going on right now, right? It's a big one. And then, of course, career. This is something that we're all thinking about constantly, but certainly in your role as a student, right? What is my future? What does it look like? What's going to happen? Is this right for me? Did I make the right choice? And then attached to that, identity. What does this say about me as a person, as a professional? Does this speak to how I view myself? Okay, going back. Perfect. I'm going to pass it on to Jannett.
So as we're talking about uncertainty and how we manage uncertainty, we want to talk a little bit about the window of tolerance. You may have heard about this before. Has anyone heard about this before? Window of tolerance? No? Okay. So the window of tolerance is the optimal zone where you can deal with stress from everyday life, right? So let's say you are an hour early for an appointment and you just missed your train, right? The stress you might feel in that situation might be manageable because you have an hour of buffer time, right? And so you might be in your optimal zone, right? This doesn't shake you very much. But sometimes there are stressors that have greater impacts on us. We might see that we react either in hyperarousal or hypoarousal. Hyperarousal, meaning we have excessive energy in the form of fight or flight responses. Hypoarousal, meaning that we have a freeze response, right? We might lack energy, we might be emotionally flat. Okay. So we've heard about fight or flight, we've heard about freeze. Not sure if we've heard about facing, right? So we'll talk a little bit about all of these. When we are in fight mode, we might be thinking about attacking, confronting, addressing, right? The emotion we might be feeling underneath is anger or irritation. The outcome in our response may be to blame, mistreat, insult. Face, we are going to see this as a challenge. We might feel calm and grounded, and our outcome may be alert, decisive, engaged. When we're in flight mode, we may want to run and hide. Our emotion might be denial, anxiety, or fear. And we may try to avoid or sabotage the situation. When we are in freeze mode, we might comply or surrender. The emotion underneath may be one of shutting down, of emptiness or numbness. The outcome might be to rationalize, justify, or detach, right? When we are in fight or face mode, we are engaging with the challenge. When we are in flight or freeze, we are disengaging. These are responses that are natural and automatic. So talking a little bit about intolerance of uncertainty. We've started to talk about this a little bit already, so this is just some additional information. Intolerance of uncertainty is the tendency to react negatively to uncertain situations on a cognitive, emotional, and behavioral level due to a set of negative beliefs about uncertainty and its implications. We might believe that the uncertain situation is stressful and should be avoided. It may lead us to an inability to act, and it might be strongly linked to excessive worry and a significant predictor of distress. Intolerance of uncertainty and intolerance of emotional arousal are the main components of anxiety. Elevated levels of intolerance of uncertainty provokes reactions of hypervigilance, where individuals are faced with uncertain or ambiguous problems. Elevated level of intolerance to emotional arousal stimulates cognitive avoidance reactions. Excessive anxiety results from a hypervigilant state or a state of avoidance. So Marisa mentioned these coping skills earlier a little bit. So sometimes we see two types of coping styles. Avoidant coping, so individuals may engage in behaviors that are related to avoiding thinking or having feelings about a stressor. That might look like seeking distraction, venting about it, or totally disengaging from it. Someone can also be using approach coping styles, which is where individuals engage in behaviors to actively cope with the stressor. So that might be finding emotional support, cognitive reframing, and acceptance. Okay. Some common responses to uncertainty. Uncertainty causes us to feel out of control. Nature and the level of uncertainty plays a role in physiological and behavioral responses. And responses to uncertainty differ based on our individual, cultural, and community factors. Now, what are some common reactions and responses? We see worry and anxiety, hypervigilance and avoidance, low mood and depression, fear, distraction or difficulty concentrating, and cognitive distortions. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these. So anxiety and worry. It's an inability to tolerate uncertainty. Anxiety is a feeling of fear, dread, or unease. Symptoms of anxiety can include rumination, intrusive thoughts, racing thoughts, irritability, and an inability to focus. There's a correlation between intolerance of uncertainty and anxiety. There's a tendency to define ambiguous situations as threatening. There's an elevated estimation of risk, and there's a tendency to generate negative scenarios in uncertain situations. High worriers are slower to make a decision when confronted with ambiguous stimuli. So a really good example of this is when someone says to you, let's say your boss, your professor says to you, I need to talk to you, right? How many of us start to feel overwhelmed right away, right? We have no idea what this person may want to speak to us about, right? But we might start to see this ambiguous situation as unsafe. Hypervigilance and avoidance. These develop as adaptive cognitive strengths in order to detect threatening activity in the environment. With hypervigilance and avoidance, there's a heightened state of awareness of your surroundings, the thoughts and feelings of people around you, of your own body and your mind. It's the brain trying to protect us. It's the brain trying to predict unforeseen circumstances by identifying cues. Low mood and depression. Depression is identified by persistent sadness, low mood, loss of interest in previously pleasurable activities, disruptions in sleep and appetite, difficulty focusing, and a lack of motivation for 2 weeks or longer. Low mood and depressive states are totally normal when faced with uncertainty. However, ruminating on your low mood or your depression may contribute to longer stretches of negative mood, right? So your low mood can feed on itself. Cognitive distortions. These are negative thought patterns that can cause us to perceive ourselves, others, and situations inaccurately. One of the most common ones that we see when dealing with uncertainty is catastrophizing. I don't know if you can see the meaning up there, so I'll read it. It says, when you expect the worst case scenario to happen to you. Is that familiar? I see some people shaking their heads. I have a really good friend that lives in catastrophizing, right? She plans for the worst every single time, so she won't be caught off guard. So she'll be able to deal with uncertainty, right? Mind reading, when you assume you know what others are thinking or feeling. Some of us engage in that, and really all of us have engaged in one of these distortions at one point or another. Should thinking, when you have rules or expectations of how things or people should be or act. Fortune telling, when you think the future is set in stone and the outcome is sure and guaranteed. Sometimes these cognitive distortions really impact the way we see ourselves. The upside of uncertainty and worry, right? We don't think that there might be an upside. But sometimes uncertainty can have some positive effects also. Moderate amounts of worry can be motivating. Worry can cue efforts to actively manage an unpleasant emotional state. Worry and uncertainty can encourage us to remain curious. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I reacting in this way? And they can encourage us to take action. If I am feeling this way, what can I do to fix it? So again, this will be part of that same form. And you're more than welcome to use this form later on for yourselves. But I'm wondering, how does anybody here, if anybody could share, how do you cope with stressors?
I like to pet my cat.
Pet your cat. Pets are an amazing form of de-stressing, right? They give us so much unconditional love. Anyone else? How do you cope with stressors? Yes.
I play music, I read poems, I call friends.
Okay, so you have more than one. Thank you. You play music, read poems, you call friends. Yes.
I go to gym.
You go to the gym. Yes. Become physical. Yes. Say that again. Yes. So you like to vent. Right. That's a really good point, right? So I'm not sure if everyone heard, but she said vent and talk a little trash, gossip a little bit, right? Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's not. That's a really good point. Sometimes the ways that we cope can be negative or they can be positive. Back there, you had something?
I usually binge eat or like journal my thoughts.
Okay. So some of us are emotional eaters, right? And so sometimes we cope with our feelings through eating or journaling, right? So getting it out of our minds, out of our hearts, putting it down somewhere can also be really helpful. Thank you for everyone who shared. Okay, passing it back to Marisa.
All right. So I love all of the coping strategies that you shared, and it sounds like you already have the start of a little coping toolkit, which is awesome. We're going to give you a couple of additional tools to add to your toolbox today. And one of the first things that we suggest when thinking about uncertainty is first focusing on what you can control. I know we always hear this, and it's so hard to put into action. But we're going to give you some tools to do so. So first thing is thinking about what matters to you. And I'm sure if we're just looking at the image on the left, that left circle, there's a ton of things in the world and in your life right now that matter, right? Yet a small portion of them fit in that other box as well, are things that you can control. So we're trying to kind of shift the focus first on the things that matter to you and that you can control. And there are some really nice examples in this other image on the right? If you look in the head section, you can see some examples here, things that we can control. Our boundaries, how we handle challenges, how we speak to ourselves. And Jannett before talked a little bit about some really common cognitive distortions that we all have and are floating around in our mind constantly. They are adaptive. They are our way of bracing for impact, trying to kind of soften our fall in case the unimaginable catastrophic event occurs, right? That's the idea behind cognitive distortions and why they're so sticky, right? But if we notice those cognitive distortions floating around in our thoughts from time to time and gently bring the focus back to, okay, what does this tell me about what's going on right now? Probably that I'm anxious about something that I don't have control over. So let me bring the focus back to what I can control right now and also validate my emotional response, that I am feeling anxious and out of control right now. Really understandable, right? So if you just kind of notice the theme of the things within our control, it's focused on us. You'll see a lot of my and I there for good reason. Things we can't control, the past and the future. And this is where our anxiety lies. Our anxiety tends to lie in the past should-haves and the future what-ifs. So when we notice our thoughts kind of floating into the past should-haves and the future what-ifs, again, gently bringing the focus back to the here and now and the what can I control in this moment and what do I need right now, which we'll get to also. So radical acceptance is the second piece to this. And I really love radical acceptance. This is why we're highlighting this, of course. It's a really wonderful tool and often overlooked. It's the second part to figuring out what we can and can't control. And really, that is accepting what we can't control. So accepting all of the things floating around, the past, the future, other people's actions, what others think of me, the outcomes of my effort, right? I can control my effort, but I can't necessarily control the outcomes of my effort. Or I can express my thoughts and feelings to someone else. I can't control how that person perceives my thoughts and feelings, right? I can't control what's going on in the world. I can control how I respond to what's going on in the world, right? And how I care for myself and cope with what's going on in the world. So radical acceptance is accepting those things we can't control And just to highlight this, it is not approval. So, for example, if someone says something hurtful or triggering to us, we can accept that it happened. That person said something hurtful to me. I accept that it happened. I do not approve that it happened. It is unfair that it happened. It is not just that it happened, but I can accept that it did happen, right? And that's all radical acceptance is. It is not an emotional response to it. It is accepting your emotional response to it. I accept that it happened, and I accept that I'm hurt by it, right? That's another piece to radical acceptance, is accepting our response to it. So I really like this example with rain. It's a pretty neutral example, so I like starting with this. If we look under the left side, the not accepting side, it says, I do not like the rain. I wish it was not raining. My day would be better if it wasn't raining. My day is ruined. Every day is just like this. It's always like this. Why does it always rain when all I want it to be is sunny, right? I see some chuckles because I think most of us can identify with that. I mean, it was just raining yesterday, I think. I had some of those thoughts. I was like, oh God, cold rain, that is literally the worst. Right? It's like a common thought. Radical acceptance is stating what seems to be obvious, but often isn't for a brain, which is, it is raining. Now, acceptance does not mean that we're not doing anything about the rain, right? I still took my umbrella with me. I still wore a raincoat. So it doesn't mean you're accepting it and you're standing in the rain and just letting it happen to yourself. Well, obviously, you're letting it rain because you can't do anything about it. But you don't have to stand in the rain by accepting it. So there's some nuance to this. You're accepting that it happened or that it is happening, and you're thinking of what you can control in that moment. What I can control is, well, so I don't have to get wet on my head. I'm still going to bring my umbrella. I'm still going to bring my raincoat, etc., etc. Now, are the thoughts about the cold rain valid? Of course. I don't expect that next time it rains, I will not have these thoughts. I will definitely still have these thoughts. The point that we want to kind of focus on is when the thoughts become overwhelming and are causing you lots of distress, that may be a sign that we need to gently bring our focus back to what can I control right now, and accepting the things that you can't control. There's another piece to this, which is kind of coping with it and giving yourself a little bit of self-care, and we'll talk about what that looks like too. So we don't just leave ourselves high and dry. We also provide ourselves with some care and self-soothing. So I spoke a lot about mindfulness already, and we hear this term thrown around a lot, right? We do because it is meaningful. And this is, again, the state of being conscious or aware of something in the moment, being in the moment, bringing your focus back to the present. So I really like this image because it kind of highlights the point I was making before, which is that our anxiety tends to lie in the past, in the should-haves, and in the future, the what-ifs. What if things don't go right? What if everyone hates me? What if I don't do well on this? What if something catastrophic happens? I should have studied more. I should have said this thing differently. I should have done this other thing, right? So mindfulness is validating those experiences, but coming back to the present of, okay, I can't control the past. I can't control the future. I can just accept what is happening now, and that I don't have control over what's next. I have control over some things, and I'm going to direct my focus to those things and cope with the rest, right? The way to do this is, of course, awareness, number one, and trying to set some time and space aside. If you're finding that in the moment it's difficult to be mindful, you can set aside some time and space to really try to practice some of these skills and try to actively turn your thoughts and your mind to the present. It does take practice. It's not an easy skill, but over time, we can start to kind of train our brains to access the present a little bit easier. one way to do this, to access the present, is through grounding strategies. So this is a simple one. It's called the 3-3-3 rule, grounding strategy, where you focus on 3 things you can see, 3 things you can hear, and 3 things you can touch or move. And I like this because it's simple. You can do it anytime. No one knows you're doing it. You could be doing it right now, and that would be great if you are. It's really helpful when you are in a state of distress, right, to bring it back to what's going on right now in this moment and orients you back to the present time and space. Because typically when we're in a state of distress, we are in the past or the future. So how do we come back to the present? Well, we can actively will ourselves to when we're practicing until we get the hang of it. So this grounding strategy is a really great way to try, right? And you simply just go through it in your mind. I see a blue wall. I see a white pillar here. I see some specks on the floor, whatever. You can be really specific, and it distracts the mind even a little bit more. Deep breathing is something that we hear about it a lot, and I often hear people say to me, look, I know I'm supposed to meditate and do deep breaths, it just doesn't work for me, right? And I completely understand both really difficult skills, and we often don't have the time or ability to really, really practice them and then wait and see kind of the fruits of our labor over time, because it takes time and practice, all of these things. Deep breathing, though, I think the other occasional issue that comes up with deep breathing is that we sometimes don't do it correctly. And there's no real right or wrong way to do it, but it's certainly more helpful when you prolong the inhale through the nose, the hold of the breath, and then the exhale, right? Sometimes people come to me and say, okay, I just did a deep breath, didn't work. And so I would just encourage you that if this is something that you want to try, you can go online or take a snapshot of this exercise, which is the 4-7-8 breathing exercise, and give it a whirl. I would also recommend putting some other sensory strategies in the mix. So while you're deep breathing, can you hold on to something soft? Can you pet your cat? Can you squeeze a stress ball? Can you tap your hand to count the breaths, right? That sometimes helps and kind of calms the nervous system in a few different ways. Flow is the state of complete immersion in one activity. You may have heard of this, and there's actually some good literature out there that connects a state of flow with waiting in an uncertain situation. So if we're thinking about getting an exam back, right, and maybe waiting for that exam to come back, the grade is really anxiety-inducing. Incorporating a flow activity, something that puts you in a state of flow, can help with the waiting period. And what does this mean? Well, it could be any activity that brings you some form of pleasure, right? And there's kind of a balance between the challenge level and the skill level needed for it. And it does require some concentration. Not so much that it's extremely frustrating, but at least a little bit. To the point where you can immerse yourself in it. Because the idea is we want it to give you a little bit of a sense of control when your world is feeling out of control. So really common examples, yoga, going to the gym, reading. It could be really anything, gardening, cooking, right? Allows you to concentrate, distracts the mind, also gives you a sense of control in the moment. They're little things that you probably already do, but when you do it with intention, it can have a slightly different effect. And Jannett will tell you a little bit more about some strategies.
Okay, so to continue our conversation on strategies. Self-soothing strategies. These are quick and effective ways of reducing the intensity of negative emotions. They can be achieved through sight, touch, smell, sound, taste. So even just now, Marisa was giving the example of, as you're doing some deep breathing, can you hold on to something soft, right? That self-soothing. Think about when possibly you were a child or you see a child and they have a favorite blanket, right? Or they had a favorite teddy bear. There was something that was very soothing about that object. We may have some of those objects now, right? Our pajamas may be really soothing, right? So it's important to engage in strategies, not just when you're faced with uncertainty, but when you're juggling any kind of negative or stressful, challenging situation is. How do you take care of yourself? How do you feed and pour into yourself? So self-soothing is one of the ways you can do that. Sorry. Okay. So as part of self-care, you can be kind to yourself. You can focus on past successes. Again, focusing on what you can control. You can work on developing new skills. You can limit exposure to triggering events when possible. You can ask for help. Specifically, when we're talking about uncertainty in the world, sometimes we need to limit our exposure to social media or media, right? Sometimes we need to protect what we are sort of ingesting and taking in. Self-compassion is the process of turning compassion inwards. It's about being kind to yourselves. It's about giving yourselves support and encouragement. Self-care, self-soothing, all of that falls under self-compassion. It's about being aware of the pain of the moment. It's treating yourself with kindness and considering your needs in that moment. It's recognizing that you are not the only one that is feeling this way, that these are normal parts of being human. Coping statements. So earlier we talked about those cognitive, I forgot what they were called. Thank you. Cognitive distortions. So these are ways of challenging those cognitive distortions, right? Sometimes just reminding ourselves, this is just the feeling and it will pass. My anxiety does not define me. This feeling is a reminder to take a deep breath. Not all thoughts are true or facts. This is a normal human emotion. And once we start thinking about things in these ways, we'll start to see other opportunities to reframe. So sometimes uncertainty is also a place for growth. This is an opportunity for, you can fill in, right? I will focus on what I can control. This is uncomfortable, but I can handle it. I give myself permission to take breaks. I can take things one step at a time. And I'll share that I was on the subway a couple of weeks ago, and I heard another little boy, maybe 7 or 8, say to another little boy, "Everyone makes mistakes. You just try again." And I thought, how wonderful that at 7 or 8, they're already learning how to reframe for each other making a mistake, right? When things don't work out the way we want them to. Okay. So we want to know, there are 2 questions here. What are your key takeaways from today? What are things that you're walking away with? And what strategies did you learn about today that you might try when you're faced with uncertainty? So I'll take some answers. If anyone feels comfortable, you can answer either one. But what are some of your takeaways? And what are some strategies you might use to cope? Yes?
I can talk a little bit about my personal experience with mindfulness. Definitely
Mm-hmm.
really helps me. So I encourage everyone to try. And I think that we really try to have like some kind of like a gratitude journal because we really do forget little things that happen to us all the time. We have this tendency of keeping focus on the bad things.
Thank you so much for sharing. So both your personal experience with meditation and with deep breathing and mindfulness, and as well with gratitude. Gratitude is another way of helping to orient us to the present moment. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Just that what I'm thinking and feeling is not necessarily an accurate representation of the reality of situations around me.
Thank you for saying that. Yes. What we're thinking and feeling may not be an accurate representation of what's happening around us. Yeah. Sometimes we need to question, what are we thinking? What's the evidence for it? What's the evidence against it? Sir?
So when we were talking about the feeling kind about yourself and all that part, my experience is like, it's like how you can feel kind to others, you know. It kind of, when I feel about myself, it doesn't go that well, even though I kind of feel selfish to myself. But when you kind of feel kind and good to others, like at least not say or do something at minimum that will hurt, I think that kind of gives end of the day a kind of comfort for me. At least I was not kind of that level, so I hurted someone. That was one thing. And second thing was about the flow, the control of events. I think we do that, we use that in our lives, but once we see that, then we kind of can put it on that framework. And you said about distraction of so much social media and all the, you know, this YouTube, all the other things. So the way I felt like sometimes when you have exact time frames, like, hey, I'm gonna do this thing just for an hour. That's it. If you have just control of that hour, even though if you don't finish the task, you will feel good. At least I controlled my time. So I think that was good to see like what I'm using, what I'm not using, and kind of learn from this.
Thank you. I really appreciated all of your comments, but in particular, sometimes it's really hard to be kind to ourselves, right? It can be so much easier to show kindness and compassion to others, and that in turn can sometimes feed us and nurture us. But one of the challenges that we're talking about with this is exactly that. It's facing that sense of guilt or that selfishness, that feeling that comes up that says, I shouldn't be this. I shouldn't give myself this, right? So there's that cognitive distortion. Thank you for sharing. Back in the back.
Well, you actually just mentioned it in your last sentence, but I really enjoyed the piece about the cognitive distortions. I think seeing it up full screen and kind of seeing the titles attached to the behavior was really nice and felt very validating. But what it made me think of is the fact that a lot of people experience these things as a trauma response. So when you talked about your friend that kind of sets the expectation for something bad happening, I do that. So kind of seeing it in real time made me think, oh my goodness, I think I do that and I've been doing that, but I think that was birthed out of trauma. So it just made me think about like ways in which that I want to continue to do the work, but it was nice to kind of see and to hear about.
Thank you for that point. Absolutely. Some of our responses are absolutely birthed in trauma, right? And so that's the next layer of the work, right? First, we're right now talking about bringing awareness to these feelings, these sensations, these cognitive distortions. Because if there isn't awareness, then we can't work on changing it. So bringing awareness to it. And I also think, thank you for sharing, that's so powerful to say, like, I see myself in that, right? I now know I'm gonna work on it, it looks like this, but to sit there, I can't imagine, right? And we've all been in these positions. I sat there and I looked at that chart the same way, and I was like, oh yeah, I do that one, and I do that one, and I just did that one yesterday, right? So to see ourselves, it's the first step in becoming aware of how do we change this, but we first start with that acceptance.
I just really want to say, learning to be kind to ourselves. And once we have kind of mastered that, then we surely can be kind to all other peoples.
Thank you. Yes, back to how do we learn to be kind to ourselves? That's such a challenge sometimes. And depending on the roles that we play, the responsibilities that we have, we can feel so guilty. So just, last week I heard someone say, how am I going to take time out to go to a Friendsgiving when I have so much studying to do? I shouldn't be at this event, right? There was the should, there was holding themselves to this very difficult standard. Where was, hey, how about I deserve some time with friends and some community, and I deserve a break? So being kind to ourselves is one of our major tasks. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, I didn't know before this that if you're uncertain about the outcome of an event, that's going to make you feel really bad, like the anxiety. So you said that the body has a response that makes you feel pain or something. If you know there's a 50% chance of getting shocked, but if you're certain you'll get shocked, you actually are better off, right? So yeah, I think that was pretty important for me to learn, and that's my key takeaway. And maybe I should reorient my thoughts and goals so that I don't put myself in such situations. And I was wondering how healthcare workers feel when they're in the emergency room, for instance, because there's this uncertainty of the outcome there, right? So yeah, that got me thinking how they deal with such stuff, and maybe I can take some lessons on that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. You're so right in saying that, and we're collaborating with the nursing school, so absolutely. How are you doing when you're with the patient, whether in the ER or outside of the ER, right? Just in the hospital on one of the floors, and you don't know what's going to happen, right? We are faced with uncertainty in our jobs all of the time. We live in uncertainty. We really do. And sometimes we're aware of the impact of that on us, and sometimes we're not. And what we're trying to talk about today is how to start to become aware of that impact on you personally. And then what do you do for yourself to take care of yourself so that you're better able to handle that uncertainty, to show up in all of the roles, the responsibilities, the places that you inhabit. Because we're not going to be able to take away uncertainty, right? So how do we start dealing with it and taking care of ourselves? Thank you. Okay. So a little bit about our services in case you don't know. So we are with Student Health on Haven, but we're specifically with counseling services. And so we offer short-term psychotherapy and psychiatric care. We have referrals for long-term care. We offer skills and support groups and one-off support sessions. There's the TELUS Health app. It's a free app for students with 24/7 access to short-term counseling support. They can also help connect you to providers in the community. This is accessible from anywhere in the world, and they offer via chat or via phone services in about 60 languages. appointment scheduling. So if you want to reach out to us, you want to connect with one of our providers, you can schedule an appointment through the student health portal. You can give us a phone call at the number on the slide, or you can always stop by and pay us a visit. Counseling services is in Tower 2 on the 3rd floor. Okay. On the 2nd floor is medical. This is in order to connect with us on our Instagram. We're about a year old, our Instagram, so it's still growing and developing, but we love to hear from students and see students engaging with our services. So I'll leave that for a minute. Okay. And for more information, you can visit us at Student Health at CUIMC.columbia.edu. And lastly, so as we're talking about taking time for yourself, right? We've talked about a lot of resources and tools. This is a tool we wanted to just give an example of a tool that's available. We found this on YouTube. It's about a minute long, right? So we're gonna play it. If you feel so comfortable, we can't dim the lights, but you can close your eyes. Please make sure your feet are planted firmly on the ground. Okay. Let's see. Let me make sure.
I want you to let yourself be here in this moment in time. Let go of expectations, of to-do lists, and be here. Be present. Take a big breath in, and on your exhale, sigh it out. Another big breath in. Exhale, let it go. One more inhale, fill up. Exhale, sigh it out. Let your mind, your breath, and your awareness of your body start to link up as one as you take this moment for you. Be present in this space.
Thank you, everyone.